Here's a situation that should terrify you. A small strip of land, barely the size of Rhode Island, sitting on Europe's edge has just become the flashpoint that could expand this war beyond anything we've imagined. Moldova and Ukraine are moving together to isolate a Russian-controlled territory that Moscow has used as a strategic dagger aimed at Europe's heart for over 30 years. And Vladimir Putin's response revealed something that should change everything you thought you knew about Russian military power. His own trap just sprung shut on his own forces. If you've been watching this channel, you know we cover the big battles, the drone strikes, the political drama between superpowers. But today we're going somewhere most channels won't touch because the story is complicated, the stakes are enormous, and the truth is that nobody outside a small circle of military planners fully understands what's actually happening. This is about Transnistria, a frozen conflict that suddenly isn't frozen anymore, and the people who live there are about to discover what happens when great power games become very real very fast. Hit subscribe, because what you're about to learn will make you understand this war in a completely different way. Let's start with the absolute basics, because you cannot understand what's happening without this foundation. Transnistria is a narrow strip of land wedged between Moldova and Ukraine. It declared independence from Moldova in 1990, 2 years before the Soviet Union officially collapsed. Nobody recognized that independence, not the United Nations, not the European Union, not a single country on Earth except 3 other breakaway regions that Moscow also controls: Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Artsakh. All of them part of what analysts call the frozen conflict belt, territories where Russia keeps conflicts alive to maintain leverage over neighboring countries. Moldova has wanted Transnistria back since the day it declared independence. Russia has kept Transnistria alive since the day it declared independence. The math is simple. One country wants its territory back. One country wants to prevent that from happening, and the people living in between have been trapped in that political game for 3 decades. The population of Transnistria is approximately 470,000 people. That's smaller than the city of Milwaukee. The territory covers roughly 4,000 square kilometers, about the size of the state of Rhode Island. It has its own government, its own military, its own currency, its own stamps, everything a country would have except international recognition. The official GDP per capita is around $3,000 per year, though that's almost certainly inflated because the economy runs on smuggling, Russian subsidies, and a massive arms trade that nobody wants to discuss publicly. The official military consists of about 5,000 troops, but that number fluctuates based on how many Russian peacekeepers are counted and how many local militiamen are mobilized. The real military power in Transnistria comes from something else entirely: the massive stockpile of Soviet-era ammunition and weapons that Russia has accumulated there since 1992. Ammunition that some estimates suggest could supply a major conflict for years if it ever got into the right hands. Now here's where it gets interesting and where most coverage completely fails to explain what's actually at stake. Transnistria sits directly on the border with NATO. Moldova, the country Transnistria claims independence from, is now a candidate member of the European Union. Moldova is not in NATO, but it's moving toward Western institutions with remarkable speed. Ukraine borders Transnistria on 3 sides: east, north, and west. That gives Ukraine extraordinary leverage over Transnistria that Moldova itself never had. For 30 years, Russia used Transnistria as a staging ground for operations against Ukraine. Russian military equipment flowed through Transnistria to reach other destinations. Russian intelligence operated from Transnistria against Ukrainian targets. Russian propaganda and disinformation campaigns were coordinated from facilities there. Transnistria was never just about Moldova. It was about positioning Russian power as close to NATO as possible, while keeping a knife aimed at Ukraine's southwestern flank. Why does this matter right now? Because in late 2024, Moldova and Ukraine began coordinating in ways they never had before. Moldova elected a pro-European president, Maia Sandu, who made EU integration and territorial integrity her signature issues. Ukraine, fresh off its Kursk operation and looking for ways to expand pressure on Russia, found in Moldova a willing partner who shared their strategic objectives. What happened next was a masterclass in how smaller countries can use great power conflicts to their advantage. Moldova began systematically tightening the economic noose around Transnistria. They worked with the European Union to impose restrictions on goods crossing into Transnistria. They increased customs enforcement at the border with Ukraine, the main route through which Russian goods and weapons had flowed for decades. They coordinated with Ukrainian authorities to share intelligence about smuggling operations and Russian personnel movements. And then they did something that no Western analyst predicted. They began applying diplomatic pressure that put Russia in an impossible position. What was that pressure? Moldova formally requested that the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, reclassify the status of Russian forces in Transnistria. The official term for what Russia has in Transnistria is peacekeeping forces. A fiction that everyone understands is a fiction, but that Russia has maintained for decades to avoid calling them what they actually are, occupation forces. Moldova asked the international community to formally recognize that the Russian presence in Transnistria violates the territorial integrity of a sovereign nation, and that Russia is occupying territory it has no legal right to hold. This sounds like bureaucratic nonsense, but it created enormous problems for Moscow. Once you formally recognize that Russia is occupying Transnistria rather than peacekeeping there, every piece of military hardware Russia has in that territory becomes illegitimate. Every soldier stationed there becomes a legitimate target for sanctions and diplomatic isolation. Every dollar of support Russia sends there becomes a violation of international law that can be prosecuted. Russia had been using the peacekeeping fiction to keep its Transnistria presence legal under international frameworks. Moldova just burned that fiction to the ground. And here's where Putin's trap backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Russia has always used frozen conflicts as a tool of strategic coercion. The threat was always the same. Accept our terms or we destabilize this territory, or we use it as a staging ground for military operations, or we create a refugee crisis that destabilizes your entire country. For 30 years, Moldova lived under that threat. Every time they tried to integrate with Europe, Russia hinted that things could get very bad in Transnistria. Every time they considered joining NATO, Russia escalated the situation in ways designed to scare them back into submission. Moldova had been trapped in that psychological game for 3 decades. But here's what Putin never anticipated. Moldova found a partner in Ukraine who was willing to call his bluff. Ukraine didn't just agree with Moldova's position on Transnistria. Ukraine had its own reasons to want Russian forces out of there. Every Russian soldier in Transnistria was a potential threat to Ukrainian territory. Every weapons depot there was a potential source of arms for Russian operations. Every intelligence facility was a threat to Ukrainian national security. So when Moldova started applying pressure, Ukraine didn't just support them quietly. Ukraine actively cooperated in ways that multiplied the pressure exponentially. What did that cooperation look like? Ukraine closed its borders to most goods flowing to Transnistria. Ukraine increased military patrols along the Transnistrian border in ways that made smuggling exponentially more difficult. Ukraine shared intelligence with Moldova about Russian military operations that had previously been unavailable. Ukraine put Russian military facilities in Transnistria on their target list for potential strikes, not because they planned to attack them immediately, but because they wanted Russia to understand that the era of using Transnistria as a safe haven was over. And then Ukraine did something that changed the entire calculation. They began publicly linking Transnistria to the broader peace negotiations in ways that made Russian isolation there inevitable. Ukraine's position was simple. We will discuss security arrangements in this region as part of any comprehensive peace agreement. Russia cannot keep Transnistria as a forward operating base while simultaneously negotiating peace. Those two things are incompatible. This is what I mean when I say Putin's trap backfired. What trap? Here's the trap. Russia has always used frozen conflicts as a way to prevent neighboring countries from joining Western institutions. The idea was simple. Moldova wants EU membership? Fine, but Transnistria is right there, full of Russian weapons and Russian soldiers. Join EU and we might destabilize that territory, create a refugee crisis, launch a military operation. Moldova had been living under that threat for so long they'd almost accepted it as inevitable. But Ukraine broke that psychological equation entirely. Ukraine said yes, Moldova should join the EU, and yes, Transnistria should be brought under proper control, and yes, Russia should remove its forces, and yes, we're going to help make that happen. The threat that had kept Moldova frozen for 30 years suddenly lost its power because the country that had been threatened decided it was no longer afraid. Now Russia's response to this revealed something absolutely critical about their actual military situation. Russia couldn't do anything. Think about that for a moment. Russia has approximately 1,500 troops officially stationed in Transnistria as part of what they call peacekeeping operations. They have massive amounts of ammunition stockpiled there. They have intelligence facilities, military depots, and a network of local collaborators who depend on Russian support to maintain their power. All of that is now under extreme pressure, and Russia can barely respond. Why? Because every available Russian military unit is committed to the war in Ukraine. Russia pulled troops from everywhere to sustain the invasion. They stripped forces from the Far East, from Kaliningrad, from internal security units. They have nothing left to reinforce Transnistria. The very trap they built to keep Moldova and other neighbors under pressure had become a liability that they could no longer sustain. They created a military presence that required constant reinforcement to maintain. When the war in Ukraine consumed all their reinforcement capacity, that presence became a vulnerability rather than a weapon. What could Russia actually do? They could threaten, and they did threaten. Russian officials warned that any attempt to forcibly reintegrate Transnistria would be treated as an attack on Russia itself. They moved additional military assets toward the border with Moldova, though the numbers were relatively small. They conducted military exercises designed to intimidate. They launched propaganda campaigns claiming that Moldova was planning some kind of violent intervention. But those threats were empty. Russia couldn't intervene militarily because doing so would require pulling forces from Ukraine, and Russia is already struggling to maintain offensive operations there. Russia couldn't diplomatically isolate Moldova because Moldova had EU membership on its side, and EU membership meant EU protection. Russia couldn't economically coerce Moldova because the EU had positioned itself as Moldova's economic partner and had committed billions to supporting their transition. Every option Russia had for responding to the situation had been compromised by the war they'd started 3 years earlier. This is what I mean when I say the trap backfired. Russia built Transnistria as a weapon designed to keep neighboring countries in line. The weapon required constant maintenance, constant reinforcement, constant attention. When Russia decided to invade Ukraine and committed everything to that operation, they lost the capacity to maintain the weapon. The weapon began to fail, and now Russia faces a choice that terrifies them. They can either pull resources from the war in Ukraine to shore up Transnistria, which would weaken their offensive capability at exactly the wrong moment. They can abandon Transnistria and lose a strategic asset they've maintained for 30 years, which would signal to every other country with frozen conflicts that Russia's commitments mean nothing. Or they can escalate the situation in ways that risk expanding the war, which nobody except the most hardcore hawks in Moscow wants to contemplate. What do I think Russia will choose? The most likely scenario is that Russia tries to maintain the status quo as long as possible while looking for diplomatic off-ramps. They'll continue making threats. They'll continue moving small numbers of reinforcements when they can spare them. They'll continue propaganda campaigns designed to scare Moldova into backing down. But the fundamental reality is that Russia is overextended, and Transnistria has become a liability rather than an asset. The longer this situation continues, the more isolated those Russian forces become. The more isolated they become, the more likely it is that something happens that Russia can't control. A local incident, a miscalculation, a defection by local collaborators who decide the Russian protection they've relied on is no longer reliable. Any of these could trigger a cascade that ends with Russian forces either surrendering or being evacuated under humiliating circumstances. Let's talk about what happens to the people living in Transnistria, because this is where the human cost becomes real. The 470,000 people living in that territory have been told for 30 years that Russia will protect them, that their way of life will be preserved, that they have nothing to fear from Moldova or Ukraine or the West. Some of them believe that. Some of them have built their entire lives around the assumption that Russia will always be there to support them. Now those people are watching their situation change in ways they never expected. Economic pressure is mounting, smuggling routes are closing, Russian support is becoming less reliable. Some are beginning to wonder what happens next. The local government in Transnistria, which has always been dependent on Russian backing, is facing questions it's never had to answer before. What happens if Russia reduces its support? What happens if international sanctions make it impossible to do business? What happens if Moldova starts offering amnesty and integration to people who want to leave? These are not theoretical questions anymore. They're becoming practical concerns that every family in Transnistria will eventually have to confront. Here's what Moldova has been offering. Moldova's approach to reintegrating Transnistria has not been military. They've been careful about that because a military solution would be catastrophic for everyone involved, including Moldova itself. Instead, they've been offering economic integration. They've been saying to people in Transnistria, you can keep your culture, your language, your way of life. You can maintain your local identity and your connections to the region you've always known. But you will also get access to European markets, European institutions, European legal protections. You will become part of a country that is growing and developing rather than one that's trapped in a frozen conflict that benefits nobody except corrupt officials and foreign powers. Some people in Transnistria are listening to that message. Some are not. But the message is out there, and it's starting to land in ways that are changing the political calculation inside Transnistria. What does this mean for the broader war in Ukraine? This matters more than most people realize because Transnistria represents a potential flashpoint that could expand the conflict in unexpected ways. Russia has always kept a small force in Transnistria, partly because of its strategic value against Moldova, and partly because it serves as a potential staging ground for operations against Ukraine. If that force becomes isolated or threatened, Russia might decide to reinforce it, which would require resources they can barely spare. Or Russia might decide to use the situation as justification for escalating elsewhere, potentially striking Ukrainian infrastructure from different directions or threatening NATO members through different channels. Or Russia might simply accept the loss and use that as leverage to negotiate on other fronts. The point is that Transnistria is not isolated from the rest of this conflict. It's connected to everything else, and the pressure being applied there is connected to the pressure being applied everywhere else. Now here's something that should concern you even more. The ammunition stockpiles in Transnistria represent one of the most dangerous legacies of the Soviet Union's collapse. Estimates suggest there are hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition stored in depots throughout the territory. Some of that ammunition is decades old and increasingly unstable. Some of it could be used to supply armed groups throughout the region if it ever fell into the wrong hands. Moldova has been trying for years to get international assistance to secure those stockpiles, but Russia has blocked every effort, using its veto power in international forums to prevent any intervention. That situation cannot continue indefinitely. Those stockpiles are a ticking clock. Something needs to happen with them eventually. The question is whether it happens in a controlled way through international cooperation, or whether it happens in an uncontrolled way through some kind of crisis that nobody planned for. This is the kind of detail that most coverage completely ignores, but it's the kind of detail that could matter enormously in the years ahead. What does the future hold? Moldova will continue moving toward the European Union. That process is now irreversible. The EU has committed to integrating Moldova and has provided billions in economic support. EU membership means EU protection, and that protection now extends to Moldova's claim on Transnistria. Ukraine will continue cooperating with Moldova because their interests align. They both want Russian forces out of the region. They both want the frozen conflict resolved. They both benefit from demonstrating that Russia cannot maintain its leverage through force. Russia will continue trying to hold on to Transnistria because abandoning it would signal weakness to every other country that relies on Russian protection. But Russia's ability to hold on to it is diminishing with every month that passes. The economic pressure will continue increasing. The diplomatic isolation will continue deepening. The military threat will continue growing. At some point, Russia will have to make a choice about what it actually values. Does it value Transnistria enough to fight for it? Or does it value its other priorities enough to let Transnistria go? Right now, it looks like Russia is choosing to let Transnistria go, slowly, reluctantly, and in ways that will eventually become undeniable. Here's the final thing I want you to think about. Every time we talk about these strategic calculations, we talk about countries and armies and political decisions. But countries and armies are made of people. The 470,000 people in Transnistria are not strategic assets. They're not pieces on a chessboard. They're human beings with families and hopes and fears who have been caught in a situation that they never chose and that they cannot control. Some of them will benefit from the changes that are coming. Some of them will suffer. Some of them will adapt. Some of them will resist. The outcome for those people will be determined by decisions made in Moscow and Chisinau and Kiev and Brussels, not by anything they do themselves. That's the tragedy of frozen conflicts. They freeze people in place while the world moves on around them. And now the ice is starting to crack. If you found this analysis useful, Please like this video and leave a comment with your thoughts. What do you think happens when a frozen conflict starts to thaw? Do you think Russia will fight to keep Transnistria, or will they eventually accept the loss? I want to hear what you're thinking about this situation. Subscribe to the channel and make sure you're watching our other content. We cover everything from the South China Sea to NATO expansion to the future of European security. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay informed, stay critical, and remember that the best geopolitics analysis doesn't tell you what to think. It gives you the tools to think for yourself. The situation in Transnistria is changing. Understanding why it matters is the first step to understanding how this entire war might end.